Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Professor Ricardo Brito, and it's a pleasure to be here with you to start our Global Management Week 2023. In this year, we are going to address three important subjects: globalization shift, climate change, and AI impacts on business and careers. We will cover daily topics with experts from different parts of the world to delve into topics that are relevant to the current scenario. Today we have with us some experts to discuss the trends of globalization and the impacts of global turbulence on business. Remember that if you haven't yet sent your questions or comments, you can post it here in the chat and we will get to them at the Q&A session, right? Before we start, I'm pleased to introduce the exceptional team that will be joining us today. Here with us is Professor Shi-Yan Tsai from the State University of New York. Professor Tsai holds a PhD in Operations Research from the Stern School of Business and is a professor at SUNY, teaching Operations Management, Information Technology, and Supply Chain. He also works with the CEO of Tatum Company and is a consultant in the areas of Operations Research, Operations Management, and Marketing Research, with clients including the Dow 30 companies, regional banks, and others. Thank you, Professor Tsai. Professor Giacomo Lafranchini of the University of Laverne is also with us. Professor Lafranchini holds a PhD in International Business from the University of Texas at El Paso and is Associate Professor of Management at the University of Laverne. Thank you, Professor. I'm also grateful for the presence with us today of Professor Paolo Bellamoli, Director of International Programs at Kuoa Business School, one of the most important business schools in Europe. Alongside with academic activities, he renders consulting services as a senior international expert for the United Nations Industrial Development Organization. Thank you, Professor Paolo. We also have with us today Dr. René Horn, a PhD in Political Economy and chairperson of the South African Supplier Diversity Council, an expert in executive training programs and consultant in the areas of finance and economics. Thank you, Dr. Horn. Talking from London, we have with us today Professor Ted Ladd, PhD in Business Administration and Director of Research at the Holt International Business School, London. And finally, Professor Tom White from California State University, Northridge. Professor White is the Chief of Revenue at the Network for Global Innovation, founder of the Storytellers Institute, and an advisor to the Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator. Let's start our today's discussion with Professor Tsai. Professor Tsai, how would you evaluate the current global landscape marked by turbulence, tensions, everything?
The current global landscape is definitely turbulent and unsettling, mostly driven by three major events. Number one, of course, is the deteriorating diplomatic and trade relationship between the US and China. And the second is the COVID-19 pandemic and its lingering impact. The number three, of course, is the recent Ukrainian wars. And according to the IBS survey, it shows that 90% of managers in developed countries and 84% of managers from emerging countries have been affected by the recent global turmoil. And according to Fortune magazine, 94% of Fortune companies are also affected by the COVID pandemic. Okay. So 2 out of the 3 events are geopolitical related, and geopolitical factors has been a major decision factor in all business decisions. Going forward, I think it is becoming more and more important because there are still a lot of unresolved conflicts around the globe.
Thanks, Professor Tsai. And for you, Professor Lafranchini, what would you say to a future business leader given the changing and challenging scenario that we are experiencing today?
Okay, so first of all, thank you for having me and the opportunity of this chat. So certainly one may, based upon recent events, surmise that globalization is significantly slowing or decline. We may be going through a deglobalization process. However, the reality is that the pandemic and certain aspects of the pandemic, for instance, shed light on the fact that we are less globalized than we may originally thought. And there is a notion that is not completely new, but it is the notion of semi-globalization that was proposed by Gemawat in Globalization 2.0 and Globalization 3.0. And it was very convenient for organizations and managers to think our world as completely integrated. But on the one hand, we saw through the pandemic that the world is integrated because the virus couldn't be contained within a specific geographical area. That is because there are exchange of merchandise, person, ideas, flow, traffic of persons, and so forth. The other facet of globalization is the idea that we are highly interconnected and therefore bottleneck on supply chain in particular country created a domino effect. That is the idea, the part of our world that is globalized. However, there is part that is not fully integrated, and that is the idea of protectionism, policies that puts barrier to trade, and so forth. Countries became partially egoistic, if you will, holding critical resources within their country's border. And that is because we have forgotten that we are not fully integrated. So this idea of semi-globalization became very evident given the recent turmoil that we have been facing, but it's always been existing. And so there is this notion or this term that was created like globaloni, which is the blend of globalization and baloney. So the tendency of significantly overestimating the level of integration that exists in our society. So if for younger managers that are approaching their position into multinational organization or global companies or transnational firms that may require their asset and skill, I would suggest that they need to become very aware of the distance that still exists between countries. An analytical tool that is very useful is what is called the cage framework that divides distance between countries according to various dimensions, being those cultural, administrative, geographic, and economic. And given that you mentioned the politics and the political environment, those are elements of the administrative distance between countries that need to be constantly monitored to observe trend and to make decisions pertaining to hedging those political risks. Political environment is dynamic by definition because in democracies we have alternate governments, and therefore decision may be reverted and the administrative environment may change accordingly. So we need to learn how to hedge those risks.
Excellent, Professor. What about you, Professor Tom? How would you evaluate today's business world?
For a young leader coming into the working world today, they have actually the opportunity to see what the world has been through with COVID, what has been caused by the tariffs and protectionist measures between the US and China, which is shifting the landscape of business opportunity. China has lost some traction, but other countries have gained. In the future, new centers will emerge where there are opportunities for production, for labor, for design, manufacturing. For the new leaders coming into positions of leadership, they're going to have the opportunity to design for this. But that means that in order to work in new centers and do new things, they're going to need to be multilingual, multicultural, at least multiculturally sensitive, empathetic, ability to navigate in cultures other than their own. Because those new centers, whether it's in Vietnam or the Philippines, they're growing centers. India, who's investing in infrastructure, those centers are going to be looking for more opportunity, and businesses that need production, that need labor, are going to go to areas where labor is available and affordable. Now we know what's possible as a result of a pandemic. That also means that leaders are going to need to plan for the future in ways that they never have before. Companies are going to need to be resilient. They're going to need to design for resilience. Funders are less likely now to fund a business who does not have as a component of their business plan a resilience component. What happens in the event of the next pandemic? Will it shut you down? No, we're not going to be shut down by that again. We've adopted new ways. We've learned new methods, new processes of connecting with each other that don't require us necessarily to be there personally.
Thanks, Professor Tom. Let's leave Americas for a bit and listen to Professor Paolo Bellamoli from Italy. Professor Bellamoli, thinking about this new global scenario that our colleagues have already explored, what are the priorities for leaders and companies to be aware and focused on to deal with these new transformations? How can companies remain sustainable under this level of adversity, Professor?
Yes, I would say that certainly we live in a scenario that is evolving. It's evolving with some paths that can be predicted, some other that cannot be predicted. So the first priority is to stay informed of what is happening in the different markets and the different geopolitical environments. It's important also to develop some key competencies, for example, cross-cultural competencies to work internationally. It's important to develop a global mindset. It's the way you approach the international markets. It's important to develop a network of colleagues and of sources of information for operating professionally and effectively. It's important to invest in continuous learning because in any fields you are operating with, whether you are a marketing manager or finance manager or operation manager, there are new tools, new knowledges, new skills that have to be professionally managed by all the responsible people in the company. So, importance of continuous learning. I would mention also a last topic that is some ethical leadership. More and more customers and the overall community pays attention to sustainability issues, to inclusion of different people. And also more and more the policies that are implemented by the different governments are influencing a lot the way the companies can operate, and they offer opportunities for developing the business in a sustainable way.
Thanks a lot, Professor Paolo. I'm inviting now Professor Ted Ladd to the spotlight. Professor Ladd, please, given this challenging scenario that our colleagues have described, is it a fact that globalization has undergone profound transformations in the last 5 years, particularly the tensions between the US and China, the pandemics, and more recently, the Ukraine war? How would you evaluate this scenario? If we look at the big picture, could we say that globalization is over?
Thank you, Professor Britu, for having me. I'm not sure globalization is dead. I think it changed dramatically, as you know. But the first one is, what should global managers be considering? And the answer is the same as we would have given them 5 years ago, but now it's sort of 10 or 20 times more important. And that is, how do you manage through uncertainty? How can you become personally comfortable with ambiguity? And how can you ensure the resilience of yourself, the pandemic, and all of the other anxiety-producing global events have actually taken a huge toll on even people who didn't get COVID. Our mental health is fragile. So how can you look at resilience for yourself? How can you look at resilience for your team, for your organization? And then how can you make your strategy more resilient? We were saying that to students 5 years ago. So that hasn't changed. What has changed is that whereas 5 years ago, people could say, yes, but the world isn't going to change that much. Now it turns out the world has changed far more rapidly and in ways we never anticipated 5 years ago. And everybody is predicting, you and me both, that change is going to continue to accelerate, and we don't know where it's going to accelerate. We used to be able to say the technological revolution will have Moore's law, right? We'll have more and more computing power. Now, I think, are we going to have more regional conflicts? Yes, I think we probably will. Where are they going to be? I have no idea. Could be South China Sea, could be Taiwan, could be Indonesia, could be unexpectedly in Latin and Central America, which are having huge political turmoil and violence just from the last few days. So I don't know where all of these problems are going to come from, but the importance for global managers, like never before, is to emphasize and prepare themselves for this uncertainty.
Thanks, Ted. That was very insightful. Well, we are capturing here excellent perceptions which together give us a better understanding of how the world has changed and help you getting ready to deal with this new global business context. We recently conducted a survey on the impacts of the global turbulence on international supply chains, getting answers from more than 4,000 managers from over 90 countries. The executive summary of this survey is already available for download. Linking this research to today's discussion, I'd like to bring Professor Paulo Bellamoli to our virtual stage today. Professor Paulo Bellamoli, on top of the constraints for international trade, there are other issues in the global economic scenario: inflation, excessive liquidity in the financial system, political polarization. Again, thinking of a young professional, what would you recommend for him or her to develop an understanding of today's world and get ready to lead companies in this turbulent scenario, Professor?
Again, I would say top priority is to stay informed, not to be sitting on what you think you can take for granted. Of course, there are some global trends that are guiding us as something that will not change. For example, issues with regard to climate change, some geopolitical issues are going to stay. But it's important to stay informed for the developments that can happen. It's important to be able to analyze economic indicators in a professional way. And I would mention inflation, GDP growth, unemployment rate, interest rates in the international markets. A global manager should be confident in understanding these issues, these instruments.
Thanks, Professor Paulo. And you, Dr. Horn, thinking about the global scenario, and especially from South African perspectives, what would you say to the new business leaders?
I do think that in the 21st century, knowledge in the form of actually data certainly actually delivers power. That's a very important component. As mentioned before, scanning your particular environment, knowing your particular actually country or your particular kind of actually market is extremely important. So as we said, knowledge is power. Understanding the elements in terms of opportunities and threats. And one of the fundamentals, and that's very key of what I actually do, is actually kind of sourcing with the problem, the solution, and the opportunity is. So when I mean the elements of problem, if you look at Africa, say, for example, we have major actually electricity constraints. Now, if you find a solution in terms of might it be actually renewables, etc., the elements in terms of solar, those particular elements are the solution, and therein lies actually the opportunity. I think the days though are gone by where we actually kind of just only seek the elements of profits, and I think that's what leaders do need to understand and managers do need to understand. That profit, yes, it is good, it is key, but we have to actually look after our society, our communities at the end of it all. And so the element of actually finding the problem for those communities and actually solving the problem for those communities is actually very much an opportunity.
It's very important to talk about this, Dr. Horn. Thank you very much. By the way, our tomorrow's discussion will be climate change, preparing companies for what's to come. But back to our today topic, Professor Sai, now, what would you say to a young manager who is preparing to lead global companies in this turbulent moment of the international business, Professor Sai?
Okay, so for young managers, I think it is important that to understand this volatile environment is not going to be an exception, but just be a norm for the future. And together with those extreme weather or AI renovations, the business environment is going to evolve quickly. So managers need to develop or adopt a risk management framework to mitigate the risk associated with all those changes. In the meanwhile, also looking for new opportunities arises also because of these changes. And specifically, I think I have a kind of 3-item suggestions. One is to continue scanning and monitoring the changing environment. For example, the decoupling trend between the US and Chinese economy. And currently there are some signs showing, but it's not very clear yet. For example, recently Mexico and Canada have just surpassed China as the #1 and #2 import country to the US market. Okay, so we need to keep watching this development, see the extent and the speed of this decoupling trend if it continues. And the second is from the supply chain perspectives. They need to develop a risk management framework so that they can handle the risk. And the supply chain risks are usually divided into 2 categories. One is called operational risk. These are caused by uncertainties in regular business environment, for example, demand fluctuations or delays in shipments or any strikes. So these are the things that managers are used to and mostly prepare for these events. But there's another types of risk, this disruption risk. And these are things usually happen infrequently, but now you can see that this because of geopolitical tensions and other factors, for example, extreme weathers. And we have also seen that these things happen more frequently than ever before. So managers need to develop a mitigation plan to cope with these risks accordingly.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts, Professor Sai. Before going ahead, I would like to once again invite everyone to participate in this discussion, sending questions in the chat or by email. After the break, we'll have our live Q&A session. And I also invite you to join the competition of startups and projects related to artificial intelligence, which is the subject of our 3rd and last day of discussions here at the Global Management Week. Going further here in our topics, I'd like to hear Professor Sai's opinion on the role of China and other emerging countries in this new context of the globalization. Professor Sai, China has been the rising star of the global economy in the past 20, 30 years. It keeps growing faster than the world average and certainly will play an important role in the global agenda. However, due to domestic and international issues, some people say China is no longer on the top of executives' mind when it comes to international expansion. Do you agree with this idea, Professor?
Okay, but generally speaking, global trade flows have returned to the pre-pandemic level. But we've already seen some decline between the trade between the US and China. Okay. So China's economic growth seems to be slowing down, and the geopolitical tension and the lingering impact from the earlier prolonged COVID shutdown may have shifted the momentum of the Chinese economic growth. Okay. So we heard a lot about concerns about the deflations, the youth unemployment, private and public sectors debts and housing bubbles, etc. And this will continue challenging Chinese economy. However, it's still the second largest economy in the world. It has a large domestic market and a huge talent pool. So maybe even if the trend continue, the shift is going to be gradual ones instead of a kind of overnight changes. Okay, there's a supply chain inertia. People are used to the way they are doing business. And so change is not easy, especially moving a supply chain. For supply chain, which is shorter, that is probably easier for companies producing apparels or shoes. They don't need a lot of suppliers or components, and they can probably move to Vietnam faster. But on other industry, like for example, automobiles, or maybe doing high-end computer servers, because the supply chain is long, and usually when a company moves, it wants their supply chain to move with them. Okay, so this is the huge task. So it's not going to happen overnight, but it also depends on the geopolitical tensions. If there's a heightened risk factor, then it would force company to make a choice faster. It would expedite this migration process. Okay, and this is why we have seen that Mexico and Vietnam has become the major player or beneficiaries in this process. And of course, there are other countries which are also constantly referred to as beneficiaries. Other than Mexico, of course, Mexico it has a major benefits. First, it is a relatively large country in terms of population, is vicinity to the U.S. market, and the trade agreement with U.S. and Canada. So that's a major benefit or competitive advantages. And Vietnam, of course, is also a relatively huge population, not as big as Mexico. It's close to China. Maybe distance-wise, to move from China to Vietnam is easier. Also, culture-wise, is probably Asian culture is closer to the Chinese culture. So maybe easier for the employees, managers to move from China to Vietnam. And India, of course, now is the most populous countries in the world. It has a large pool of young people, talents, and a large underdeveloped domestic market. Okay, so that's a huge potential. Brazil also has a huge population, and it's rich of natural resources, and it's also one of the largest agricultural products exporters in the world. So these are the few countries constantly mentioned that will be able to take up these opportunities to grow their economy.
Thank you so much, Professor Tsai. We were seeing on the screen very interesting data collected in our research. You can access the survey executive summary by visiting our website or using the link in this video's description. I'd like to hear Professor Led's take on the possibility of other emerging countries gaining more space in international supply chains in the current context. Back to Professor Led. Are we having a window of opportunity for emerging countries like India, Mexico, Vietnam, Cambodia, Brazil, and others to amplify their economic development nowadays, Professor? Would any country be able to replace the industrial machine Beijing has improved over the last few decades?
China's growth went from reportedly 6% now to 4%, but lots of people think that it may be much less than that. China announced a few days ago, or at least some people have done reverse imputation, since China doesn't publish statistics that often, that as opposed to the inflation that we're seeing in other parts of the world, China is actually experiencing deflation, which is a problem for a central government to manage. Right? We have tools for inflation. We don't have good tools for deflation. So China is going to remain concerned about its own economy. And that means that its nationalistic policy is China for China's sake. We're going to play the long game, but we're going to do everything we can with our centralized planning to maximize our own long-term success. In other words, they're not really playing free market economics. That's fine. Right? That's a recipe that has worked for them for a long time. One of the reasons it's worked for them for a long time is because, like all developing countries, they were doing import substitution, and more importantly, their economy was based on imitation. Take what other people have done and replicate it as best you can. Take what other companies have done for manufacturing and become a manufacturing center. The challenge for China is it caught up in lots of these industries. Electric cars, it's now a leader in electric cars. Artificial intelligence, they are at the forefront of artificial intelligence. So China no longer has the ability to imitate. If you're the best, there is nobody to follow. So now China is going to find itself in this interesting position where the rest of the world is going to be looking at China saying, we don't want to go to China. We don't want to use Chinese artificial intelligence or Chinese cars, but we're going to imitate just as you did to us. And I think that will increase this global competition. It will also increase these nationalistic barriers.
Excellent, Professor Ted. In our survey with leaders from over 90 countries, we observed India's strong growth in the global markets. Now, I would like to hear Professor Led's opinion on the possibility of other developing countries like Brazil eventually increasing their participation in global supply chains. Would you share your opinion with us on the matter, Professor Led?
India has an enormous, very well-educated domestic market. Indian suppliers should be focused. Yes, they might have business from other people who are trying to get out of China, but I hope India manages to harness its political might, which is an open question, right? There's lots of controversy there, in order to manufacture and develop services for its domestic audience. This is what we're seeing in the United States, despite all of our political polarization, which is only going to increase in the next 2 years in the head up to an election. We're still seeing domestic companies focusing on domestic consumers. And that has been, so far, a good recipe for increasing our own economic resilience. So my hope for Brazil, don't try to become the replacement manufacturer for the Northern Hemisphere. Develop Brazil's own internal economy, including its educational system, its public infrastructure, so that Brazilian consumers want to consume Brazilian goods. Play the same nationalistic game that everybody else is playing. Now, Brazil has its own political turmoil, just as everybody else does. And so the trick for the large and even mid-sized companies in Brazil will be, how do we find the real options in our scenarios so that we can build the right products and the right services for domestic consumption, and hopefully be able to avoid the future turmoil in the political system? That's a very tall order. It's easy for a business school professor to be able to say that. It is much harder for a manager to react to. But unfortunately, that's the best advice I can give. Focus on domestic consumers and see if you can pick strategies and options that defend against the future political crises that most large companies are going to continue to see.
Thanks, Professor Led. Now, I'd like to hear Professor Giacomo's opinion on this issue of expansion, the dispersion of global supply chains, Professor. Eventually, with other countries joining China, sharing part of China's importance in global supply chains. Professor Lafranchini, do you believe that space is opening up for emerging countries to improve their economic development nowadays, Professor?
Certainly is a very smart move to start diversifying our supply chain, creating some redundancy in the system. But that's not something that could happen overnight. And in fact, the IPS survey partially indirectly shows this, indicating that while roughly 1/3 of the companies surveyed were thinking about delinking from China, there were roughly a 20% of the firm that responded that they were instead planning on expanding into China. That is from the production side. If you look at China as a potential outlet or output markets or markets for our output, well, we see that the government, Beijing, is investing in resources in spurring the development of the internal market. We saw a slight increase in Shanghai stock markets and so forth, which means that the internal demand is growing and that would give opportunities to companies in the near future. So China will remain on companies' radar for a while, but I see great opportunities at this point in time for other countries to step in and bridge the gap.
Thank you so much, Professor. But do you believe China is still at the top of the world's negotiations? Do you believe that seeing these opportunities, countries like the ones we see in the ranking of our research, can in the coming years replace or perhaps reduce the room that China occupies nowadays?
With regards to China, I would say that China is still in the top of companies' interest and is on companies' radar for a simple reason. If you look at the foreign direct investment toward China, they used to be 111 billion a year pre-pandemic. The number today exceeds that, is roughly $120 billion. The exchange, the trade between the US and China, according to the US Bureau of Statistics, is $500 billion, so 440 roughly $1 billion in import and roughly $200 billion in export. So I don't think that someone could reasonably believe that China should be overlooked right now. It will take a very long time to replace China for a set of reasons. One, China developed expertise, human capital, through economy of agglomeration. So we created industrial companies through investment, created industrial hubs in China. Those are clusters where a lot of expertise, efficient manufacturing, high-skilled worker tend to be clustered, and so companies have an incentive in being there. In order to move your production from China to elsewhere, you need to make sure that infrastructure and human capital, social capital, is developed in those other locations. We saw Apple, for instance, attempting to do so by moving production partially to India, but it's a very gradual, very lengthy, and very painful process that will ultimately take some time.
Excellent, Professor. Thank you very much. As we are talking about opportunities for emerging countries, I'd like to hear Dr. Horn's opinion. What about you, Dr. Horn? How do you see these opportunities for emerging countries?
So the relative advantages of China was actually manufacturing at low cost. But of course, in terms of China, it has tripled over the last decade or so by way of this. And so many of the particular kind of companies or executives making those particular decisions in terms of supply chain are now looking at alternatives and of course finding actually cheaper alternatives such as that of Mexico. So some are also actually are actually pointing out the decoupling in other words, a wider geopolitical decoupling, in terms of global trade. So executives are finding it more prudent to improve the resilience of their supply chain. In other words, lower costs are not only just the only element, but also actually kind of looking at particular elements in a more smarter way. So not only the element of low costs, but what are we looking at in terms of elements such as soft skills, such as the services that we actually would like to actually command from actually that particular kind of a country or particular region, so to speak. So I do think that we're going to actually see something that's new. We're going to actually be really much in the front of it. And I think in terms of our particular study, we're very much at the forefront of what's going to actually be the next line or the next step or the way forward, so to speak.
Thanks, Dr. Horn. We are close to the end of our first day, and how amazing insights, ideas we already have got from these experts we are honored to welcome here today. Remember that tomorrow's topic is climate change, preparing companies for what's to come. And on the last day of our Global Management Week, we will have 4 experts talking about artificial intelligence impact on business. Let's now move on to the final round of questions. And since Dr. Horn is still with us, let me ask her one more question, please, Doctor. The recent turbulence have disrupted most of the international supply chains, leaving hundreds of thousands of companies without their much needed supplies. Is it correct to think that managers will now work on developing more resilient supply chain structures? And if so, how can they do that, Dr. Horn?
Thank you so much, Professor. And I mean, outbreaks of, COVID-19, your geopolitical tensions, underscore the urgent need to look actually beyond actually the costs as mentioned. But I think, diversifying your production to alternate locations as well is very important. It will lower actually your risk as well. Some people also kind of mention the elements of vertical integration as well. Companies should be actually very much prepared for alternatives in terms of actually assembly and production beyond actually the elements of China. And of course, in the survey that we've actually conducted, we've seen that by way of the 79% of companies actually searched for actually domestic supplies. Whereas in terms of actually some companies, they actually kind of looked at 81% of them, if I recall, that they actually looked actually for actually an alternate supplier to that of China. So we are actually seeing that decoupling. We are seeing that there may be a new era in terms of actually, the end of the so-called made in China.
Thank you so much, Dr. Horn. And for you, Professor Giacomo, how do you see this new scenario of global supply chain, and what would you say to new leaders and managers?
Yes, that's an excellent point, and we already see major large corporations investing. So companies became more aware of the notion of semi-globalization. They would probably be working on capitalizing and creating global economy of scale for the portion of our societies that, let's say, are integrated, so where economies of scale and scope can be created, and will be more mindful of the portion of our society that is not fully integrated. And they will work on things such as develop redundancy in the system, to have a parallel supply line and not remaining without, at the mercy of a single supplier. They will work on diversifying their portfolio of markets, the portfolio of suppliers, and potentially distribution channels. They would probably work on more collaborative agreements to make sure we have common shared long-term goal. And they will engage in significant, or they are already to some extent engaging in hedging strategies, even very long-term strategies. Recently, Stellantis announced how they made a 10-year agreement for supplying supplying of rare earth material for battery technology from plants that are yet to be built in Lithium Valley in Southern California, right? So we see companies moving more and more to aggressively towards a better hedging of the risks, and that comes from the external environment that we have seen is a lot more turbulent and dynamic than we originally thought. So to have stronger companies in the future, we will have to move this way, and those who fail to develop dynamic capability and adapt to the current scenario will ultimately become zombie companies and disappear. And in the aftermath of this environmental jolt, we will be left with companies that are much stronger.
Thank you very much, Professor Lafranchini. And to close this session, I'd like to ask Professor Tom White his opinion about the profile of leaders of this new context. Professor White, considering everything that the world has been through in the last couple of years, everything we are discussing today, in your opinion, what is the new profile of a young entrepreneur or young manager who could be the leader in this new context the world is facing now?
To be a leader in the world we're entering, in my opinion, requires a certain kind of entrepreneurial thinking. We need to design for what could possibly happen. We know that business is not going to be business as usual. So that means that we need to be nimble, we need to be agile, we need to be able to think on our feet while at the same time leading an organization who's looking for stability, even though we know as leaders, it might be anything but stable going forward. So to be able to navigate different cultures, different economies, and new ways of doing things that the organization may not have anticipated before. Forging alliances and collaborations among departments, among business units, among companies, different sorts of relationships than your company probably has now. Those are going to need to be explored. And so the new wave of leaders coming in are going to have the opportunity and the challenge of navigating a new collaborative environment, both within the organization, with other companies who are also seeking collaboration in different parts of the world as these companies go and create new markets in different parts of the world.
Wonderful, Professor White. Thank you very, very much. We had a great day of discussion so far, and I'm already looking forward to see what's coming up in the next days. After the break, we'll have our Q&A session. So if you have already submitted your questions in advance, thank you very much. But if you haven't, leave your questions or comments in the chat. We'll be back in a moment. Hello, everyone. We are back now for our Q&A session of the first day of the discussions of our Global Management Week 2023, the day we discuss the new trends of globalization. With the geopolitical tensions, the pandemics, and the recent Ukraine war, supply chains around the world have been disrupted, and we need to understand how organizations are redesigning their process to adapt to this new reality. For this, we conducted a survey that had the participation of more than 4,000 managers from 90 plus countries. You know, the report is available on our website. We also had the opportunity to debate today with great experts. Thank you very much, guys. And now we will be able to talk to you, to the participants of our event in this Q&A session. The purpose of this discussion, of this whole discussion, of this reflection, is to be able to build a vision about how companies are reacting to these new changes and what is the path of success in the new context in which we are immersed. And with this vision, this understanding, to be able to help managers redesign their organizational structures to avoid the threats and take advantage of the opportunities arising from this moment. And this whole discussion was only possible with the support of a great team of our school, IBS Americas, and the support of several university institutions in Europe, the US, and other countries. Now we start our conversation here with the audience. I will start with the questions submitted in advance and then get into the questions and comments sent during our conversation. There was a huge debate here in our chat. Thank you very much. There were so many contributions, so I will try to group the main questions and answer as best as I can. The first question was sent by Aparna Maria Raju. She asks, what are the potential risks associated with over-reliance on global supply chains, and how can businesses mitigate them? In the same line of thought, Mr. Gerardos asks us, what are the key lessons that business can learn from the recent global turbulence, and how can they prepare for future disruptions? Sadly, we will have other disruptions ahead of us. What are the key challenges and opportunities that business face in this new global landscape? Well, Aparna, Gerardo, it's possible to say that until the 70s, most organizations lived a reality of isolation within their countries of operation. Even a company that operated in more than one country, this company had in each country a performance apart from other countries, developing local suppliers to supply local and regional markets. You understand? Well, this was the classic model of so-called multinational companies. With the beginning of globalization, this political and economic phenomenon of the 90s that opened the world's commercial borders, companies began to fragment their production chains among several countries, seeking to reduce costs and improve product quality. Then we can say that a new model of action of companies emerged, called from that moment on no longer multinationals, but transnational corporations. Instead of having a complete verticalized operation in different countries, like mirroring these structures in different countries, the organization extends its operations to the whole world, having a horizontalized operation throughout the world. This was only possible due to the more favorable international environment, with more regulation from the consolidation of the World Trade Organization in the early 90s. Well, the scenario has now changed, and it has changed a lot. Political movement, which has former President Donald Trump as the leading exponent in the world, has worked incessantly to create difficulties for cooperation among countries. And this sparked the start of the world's political tensions in 2018, with the blockade of imports from China by the US being aggravated later then by the pandemics and now the war in Ukraine. As a result of this new context, we are currently witnessing the emergence of a new model of action, a model that merges elements of the resilience of multinational companies, the old model, with the flexibility of transnational corporations, the model that emerged after globalization. We have discussed this topic with leading experts today, and we will soon launch a new report and a specific publication on this topic in order to guide managers on how to redesign their structures and within this new reality of companies. All right, Aparna and Gerardo. Well, going ahead here, Mr. Rubin Popola from Nigeria makes a comment and then he poses a question for us. He says, COVID-19 and Ukraine war have affected global supply chains. For most African countries that depend on foreign goods, this has increased inflation rates. Among other topics, among other regions, Mr. Rubin, how can we, as business leaders, leverage on these accuracies to encourage local production in Africa? That's a nice question. What we have noticed in recent years, Mr. Rubin, which was also observed in our survey and was reflected in the debates with the experts gathered today here, is that supply chains were concentrated in a few suppliers. This has compounded the difficulties brought on by both geopolitical tensions and the pandemics and more recently the Ukraine war. Everything indicates that in the redesign, in the restructuring of global production chains that is now being done around the world, there will be room for new regions to seek to insert themselves more intensely in the major flows of value that cross borders. This task must be performed both by the public sector, by governments, and by the private sector, by the companies. In our study, which will have a new, more complete version of the final report sent to all participants of this event in the coming weeks, in our study, we observed the criteria used by companies to select the new supplier countries and to select the new supplying companies as well, different sets of criteria. If your company wants to integrate into global value chains, I suggest that you know the criteria adopted by companies to define who will be the new supplier of inputs, given the breakdown of production chains that we have observed in recent years. The time could not be more opportune, in my view, for this integration of new companies, new countries, and we, as an institution with a strong presence in emerging countries, we are very pleased to be able to offer our humble contribution to this development with this debate here. Thank you once more, Mr. Rubin, for your participation. I now have two more comprehensive questions on the issue of economic integration among countries, something that today has been discussed more in the face of the changes experienced by the world. First, from the Philippines, Jayacinth Geroshi, I'm sorry of my pronunciation of your name, asks us, how can international business overcome challenges in the currency exchange and inflation rates? And Mr. Mohammed Karizada asks, what are the consequences of globalization on income inequality within and between countries? Well, these are really complex questions, and I'll give it a try here, right? After the World War II, several multilateral cooperation organizations were created to take care of various aspects of relations among countries. Let's name a few. The World Bank and IMF take care of financial relations among countries and international economic stability. The most important of them was the United Nations. The United Nations organization, the UN, was created at this time to take care of political problems, to prevent geopolitical disputes from evolving into military conflicts. The GATT, G-A-T-T, GATT, which was the first agreement to regulate international trade signed shortly after World War II, and then in the 90s evolved to constitute an institution, which is the World Trade Organization, was and continues to be responsible for establishing rules of trade among countries. With the election of Trump once more in the United States, there has been a sharp shift in the American foreign policy. As the political movement that sustained Trump in the United States has spread to several other countries, the foreign policy of those other countries has also been affected. I'm talking too much about Trump. I'm sorry for that. And I'm not going to get into the merits of whether I like Trump personally. This is not the case. I'm not going to discuss whether vaccines are important to public health or whether the world is flat, whatever. That I will leave up to each one. But I can tell you with certainty that this effort to block American imports to force the production of goods within the United States, it's a huge mistake that has already caused losses of the orders of trillions of dollars to American companies and to consumers in that country, and it will continue to delay the economic development of the United States, and it will affect the economic development of the world in general. What happens in this case is this. Let me try to explain the basics of international trade. You have a company in the United States or in any other country that locally produces for some products. This is an example. It imports inputs from other countries because these inputs are cheaper in other countries, because a company from another country dominates a technology that no one dominates in the country where it operates, among other reasons for these imports. If the government creates obstacles for imports, the company that depend on these imports will experience difficulties. As simple as that. If a company imports finished products and redistributes internally, it does so because the external supplier is cheaper or technologically superior than local suppliers. When the government imposes import restrictions in order to force local production, the consumer is the one who will pay the bill. Since the beginning of the development of the economics as a science, since the first studies on the economics of international trade, it has always been perceived, realized that the ideal is that countries cooperate with each other, that there is a specialization among countries related to which country will be producing what. Today, it's known without a shadow of doubt that more trade is always better than less trade for the economic development of all countries involved in the international trade. The idea of closing borders to create jobs is wrong. It's a lie. The advocates of this policy in the US and other countries that are adhering to this Trump policy agenda know this all too well. Companies from emerging countries can take advantage of this turbulent moment to increase their participation in global production chains. Given that, what we have observed and our research has confirmed, has given numbers to a general perception, is that companies are taking two different actions at this moment. First, faced with the difficulties of importing from their old suppliers, they are now seeking to develop new suppliers in countries from which they can still carry out imports. And for this, they apply a set of criteria to select countries and suppliers that our survey has also mapped. And second, the second action taken by companies in this context, we see a greater fragmentation of supply chains, an effort to make structures more resilient. The current government of a country can be politically aligned to the neighbor, but with a new election, things may change and the company cannot be dependent on a single supplier. All right? And now we'll try to answer the questions sent during the chat. starting with the question sent by Mr. Saida Yakub. And there is another question sent by Kender Kumar in mostly the same direction. What is the effect of globalization on the development of any countries? And Kender Kumar, more or less the same question, how globalization offers business to grow, a plethora of opportunities to grow and expand their operations. Mr. Yakub, Mr. Kumar, the idea is basically summarized in this aspect. The more commerce, the more development for the companies, the more development for the economy, more development for the government, for the country as a whole. We cannot expect that a country that isolates itself, even obliging consumers to buy products from the local companies, will grow faster than the world average. We cannot expect that. The economics has proven from several different perspectives that this idea is wrong. Naturally, and we have questions about that, that I will read later on. Naturally, the current moment of the international political landscape is obliging companies to find new suppliers, to find new ways to survive under the turbulence that we are experiencing the last 5 years. But doesn't mean that this turbulence, this scenario of isolation is the best solution for the world. That's definitely not true. All right? Thank you very much. Let's go ahead here because we are running out of time. John Paul Guzman asks, how have recent global conflicts and geopolitical tensions affected international trade and business operations? And more importantly, how can business overcome them, this turbulence? Well, John Paul, thank you very much for your question. I believe this is the central question of our debate here. How companies can overcome this turbulent moment and eventually take advantage of that. Think of a company or a country that was not so far integrated in the global value supply chain structures. Well, this is the moment of your life. This is the moment you should try to insert your company, insert your country in global supply chains. Why is that? Well, basically because the global supply chains are being reorganized at this moment, and this is a good moment for you to present yourself, to introduce yourself as a valid contender. How to become a valid contender? How to pose your company as a valuable supplier for these international global supply chains? Well, our research has showed the best way for that. Our research shows what are the main criteria used by companies and when selecting suppliers, and also how these companies select the countries where they will locate their supply chain structures. So look at the research findings, look at the summary, and then find your way up to the ladder of global supply chains. All right? And reaching to the end of this debate here, the last question comes from Mr. Chikaran Chimisena. How can we overcome these challenges of globalization and implementing globalization in today's business world? Well, I will send a positive message to you all guys now here. In my view, this turbulence will pass because the world will be better off without them. There will be a strong pressure within countries to the government sit again on the table, discuss and resume normal cooperation among countries. This is my understanding based upon what we have seen in the world in the last 100 years. Every time the global tensions arise, the economic suffers, the company suffers, the consumer suffers, the citizens suffer, and then everybody puts a pressure to normalize the situation because we need to work, we need to consume, we need to have our lives back. But in the process of resuming normal relations among countries, probably companies will need to adapt to these new turbulent moments, creating more resilient structures, and probably even when resuming the normality of international relations, these new structures will prevail with more spread out structures of supply chain, with more resilient structures feeding companies with their much needed supplies. All right. Well, thank you very, very much for joining us in this debate. I'd like to invite you to join tomorrow's discussion on climate change, how the world is dealing with these changes, and how companies can thrive in this new uncertain environment. Thank you very much. Looking forward to seeing you tomorrow for our second day of uh, this week of discussions promoted by IBS with the support of international universities from the United States and Europe. Thank you very much. See you tomorrow at the same time. Bye bye.